Europe, in the late 18th century, was changing violently and unpredictably. In France, a wave of anger rose from the people who had long been exploited, from the starving villages to the crowded cities. They rose up. They overthrew their king. They tore down an order that had lasted for centuries. And then, the head of King Louis XVI fell beneath the blade of revolution. It wasn't just a sentence passed on a man. It was a declaration of war on the entire monarchical system of Europe. The kings and emperors of Britain, Austria, Russia, they were terrified. They looked at France like a wildfire reaching their dry fields. They knew, if they didn't put it out quickly, it would burn through everything, their crowns, their courts, their world. And so, they formed a coalition, an alliance against France. Not just once, but again and again. They gathered nation by nation, army by army, swearing to restore France to the old order. But while they were still hesitating over maps, France handed the sword to a young man from Corsica, Napoleon Bonaparte, a man with no noble blood, a man not born to rule, but one who carried within him a fire, a brilliance that history only grants once in many generations. And from that moment on, the war was no longer simply between monarchy and revolution. It became a struggle between all of Europe and one single man. The first coalition was formed in 1792. It included Austria and Prussia, followed by Britain, Spain, the Netherlands. All of them marched toward revolutionary France, hoping to crush the flames of revolution early on. But they were wrong. The French people, once only farmers, craftsmen, now held weapons in their hands, not just to defend land, but to defend a belief in freedom and justice, something they had never known before. In battles like Valmy and Jemappes, they sent a message loud and clear: "We, France, will not kneel." Then came the second coalition. Russia joined, the Ottoman Empire joined, Naples joined, a large portion of Europe gathered again to pressure France. Napoleon, at that time, was far away in Egypt, chasing the British trade routes, and they thought, just maybe, this time would be different. But Napoleon returned, not just as a general, but as the one who now held France's destiny in his hands. In a few swift moves, he crushed the Austrians again in Italy and forced them to sign a treaty. Even the British signed the Treaty of Amiens, a rare moment of silence in an otherwise endless storm of war. But peace didn't last. The third coalition rose in 1805. Britain again, Austria, Russia, Sweden. But despite their numbers, they couldn't stop what was coming. At sea, yes, the British won. At Trafalgar, but on land. At Austerlitz, Napoleon delivered a blow so precise, so overwhelming, that the coalition shattered like glass. Austerlitz, the Battle of Three Emperors, became legend. Then came the fourth coalition. Prussia stepped in, furious about French power in Germany, but in just a few weeks they were crushed at Jena and Auerstedt. Then Russia fell at Friedland. Peace came in the form of the Treaty of Tilsit, with Europe bowing once more. In 1809, Austria tried again, the fifth coalition. They hoped France was stretched thin, distracted in Spain. But at Wagram, Napoleon stood tall once more. Even more, he married the daughter of the Austrian Emperor, Marie-Louise, binding the enemy to him in name, if not in trust. One by one, the coalitions rose and fell. Over and over, a grim melody of hope and defeat. And yet, what struck me most, Europe never gave up. They lost, but they stood back up, and in every defeat, they learned a little more. By 1812, Napoleon stood at the very peak of power. Nearly all of Europe had either bowed to him, been forced into submission, or learned to tread carefully. And he believed if he could defeat Russia, if he could bring that last piece into line, then there would be no one left to challenge him. And so, he marched over 600,000 men, a force the likes of which Europe had never seen. Not just Frenchmen, but Italians, Poles, Germans, Spaniards, the armies of an empire. But Russia did not fight as others had. They didn't meet him head-on. They retreated. They burned their own cities. They tore away anything Napoleon's army could eat, rest in, or hold. When Napoleon finally reached Moscow, he didn't find victory, he found ashes. The city had been abandoned, burned to the ground by its own people. He waited, but no peace. offer came, winter began to fall, and so he turned back. But the road back was worse than any battle. Snow, hunger, disease, exhaustion, horses collapsed, men froze, standing. Guns were abandoned in the snow. An army of more than 500,000 returned as less than 100,000, and the rest of Europe saw its chance. Britain, Russia, Prussia, Austria, Sweden, one after another, they rose. And this time not from fear, but from hope. This was the Sixth Coalition, and they were different. Now, better organized, more united, more determined. In Germany, people rose up. In every occupied nation, the cry for freedom returned. In 1813, at the Battle of Leipzig, the largest battle Europe had ever seen, at that point, Napoleon was defeated, and just months later, in 1814, Paris fell. Napoleon abdicated the throne, and he was sent into exile on the island of Elba, it seemed. Like the story was over, the world exhaled. Europe began to hope again for peace, for normalcy, for life without war. But Napoleon, was not a man who stayed in the shadows. After his defeat, Napoleon was gone. Exiled, silenced. A mighty emperor now confined to a tiny island, Elba, floating alone in the Mediterranean. And for a moment, the world breathed easier. But in March 1815, he returned. Not with a grand fleet, not with thousands of men, just a handful of loyal followers and an unshakable will. He landed quietly on French soil. And when people saw him, they remembered. The farmers, the workers, the old soldiers, they came. The troops sent to arrest him laid down their weapons and saluted. And just like that, within weeks, he had reclaimed his throne, not with blood, but with memory. Europe froze in shock, but not for long. This time they did not hesitate. The Seventh Coalition was formed. Britain, Prussia, Austria, Russia, and more. They would not wait for Napoleon to act. They would strike first, and then came the day. June 18, 1815, Waterloo. Napoleon once more led his army. Still brilliant, still fearless, still the man who had shaken the continent, but time had changed everything. Rain fell the night before, drenching the fields, slowing his movements. Plans were delayed, messages misread. And across the field, waiting with cold patience, was Wellington and the British Army, and from the east, like the turning of a page, came Blucher, leading the Prussian forces to armies. One chance, and it slipped away. By the end of that day, Napoleon was defeated, captured, and this time he was sent far to St. Helena, a lonely island in the South Atlantic where no army would come, no escape would be possible, no banners, no marching drums, just one man. Once an emperor of Europe, now utterly alone. I often wonder, in those final quiet years, did he regret? I don't know, but I believe he still thought to himself, I was not born to die in bed, but to shake the world. Napoleon died. Far from France, far from the battlefields, far from the roar of cannons and the echo of crowds chanting his name, on a lonely island in the middle of the ocean, St. Helena, he breathed his last. But the story he left behind didn't die with him, because the anti-French coalitions, they were never just fighting a man. They were fighting a force, an idea, a truth that terrified them, that the world was changing whether they wanted it to or not. Napoleon was feared, but he was also studied. Even his enemies learned. From him, he changed how Europe thought about war and about leadership. He brought modern laws, reformed education, restructured governments. He proved that greatness does not require noble blood, only vision, will, and relentless effort. And the coalitions that rose to stop him, at first they failed over and over, but then they grew stronger, more unified. They adopted new strategies, better coordination, and national mobilization, all things they had learned from the very man they were trying to defeat. In 1815, the victors gathered at the Congress of Vienna to redraw Europe's map and restore the old order. They tried to make sure no one like Napoleon would ever rise again. But, while they moved borders and reseated kings, they couldn't erase the ideas Napoleon had carried across the continent. Liberty, merit, national identity. The belief that every man could dream bigger than the world allowed, don't you know? When I speak of Napoleon, of these coalitions, of war and defeat, I don't speak just to recall history, I speak to remind us that power may fall, but purpose endures. Europe didn't rise again by pretending nothing had happened. It rose by learning. And so can we. Short dialogue for those who still don't understand asterisk in the final years of the 18th century. Europe stood at a crossroads. The French Revolution had shattered the old world order, toppling kings and awakening a new spirit of liberty, equality, and rebellion. But with that revolution came fear, especially for the monarchies of Europe. What had begun in France, could they feared, spread to every throne on the continent. To stop the revolution from burning across their borders, the great powers, Britain, Austria, Russia, Prussia, and others formed what history calls the anti-French coalitions. One after another, they rose 7 coalitions in total, each with the same aim, to crush revolutionary France, and later, the man who rose from it, Napoleon Bonaparte. Napoleon was no ordinary general, born on the island of Corsica. Not into nobility, but into ambition. He rose through the chaos of revolution to become Emperor of the French. And from there, he began to redraw the map of Europe. In battle after battle, Austerlitz, Jena, Wagram, Napoleon outmaneuvered, outhot and outfought his enemies. He built not only an empire, but a legend. Each coalition tried to bring him down, and each time he stood taller. But greatness breeds hubris. In 1812, Napoleon made a fateful decision to invade Russia. He marched over 600,000 men into the cold vastness of the East and watched them die one by one. Not by bullets, but by snow, starvation, and silence. That campaign shattered his invincibility. Sensing weakness, the nations of Europe rose once more, this time united smarter, stronger, and no longer afraid. The Sixth Coalition defeated him at the colossal Battle of Leipzig. In 1814, Paris fell. Napoleon was exiled to Elba, but even that wasn't the end. In 1815, he returned. One last time, the world held its breath. For 100 days, Europe trembled. Then came Waterloo. His final stand, he lost. This time, he was sent to St. Helena, in the middle of the Atlantic, far from armies, from crowns, from glory. There, he died alone. But his story lived on. Because the coalitions weren't just fighting Napoleon, they were fighting a changing world. And though they restored monarchies and redrew borders, they couldn't undo the ideas that Napoleon helped spread: merit over birth, nation over king, freedom over silence. This was not just a war of swords and maps. It was a war of belief, and its echoes still shape the world we live in today.